Welcome. Thank you to everyone joining us online and here at the ASU California Center at the historic Herald Examiner building. With great respect, Zócalo Public Square acknowledges the Yuhaviatam, the first people of this ancestral and unceded territory of Yaangna that we now know as downtown Los Angeles. We honor their elders, past and present, and the Yuhaviatam descendants who are part of the Gabrieleño Tongva and the Fernandeño Tataviam nations. We recognize that the Tongva are still here, and we are committed to lifting up their stories, culture, and community. As Ku'iyam, we recognize our responsibility and obligation to care for their land. I'm Sarah Rothbard. I'm a senior editor and manage the annual Book and Poetry Prizes at Zócalo Public Square, an ASU media enterprise. At Zócalo, our mission is to connect people to ideas and to each other. Everything we do is free, and everyone is welcome. We publish original writing and present conversations like this one. You can find us at zocalopublicsquare.org, on podcast platforms, and on YouTube. So please subscribe for our latest programs. Thank you for joining us tonight to celebrate the 2024 Zócalo Book Prize and Poetry Prize. We are so grateful to Tim Disney for championing these awards and for his sponsorship. The Book and Poetry Prize Awards and this entire program have been made possible by his stewardship and generosity. In a few minutes, Mr. Disney will present the 2024 Zócalo Book Prize to Héctor Tobar for his book, Our Migrant Souls, a meditation on race and the meanings and myths of Latino, which our judges selected as the best nonfiction book on community, human connectedness, and social cohesion published last year. Héctor will give a short lecture on these themes and one of the book's central ideas, what is a Latino? Then he will be interviewed by Natalia Molina, American historian, 2020 MacArthur Fellow, and a Zócalo board member. Afterward, please join us for a reception to celebrate our winners and continue the conversation. But first, I'm pleased to present the winner of the 2023 Zócalo Poetry Prize, Melanie Almeida, writer of the poem that best evokes a connection to place. Melanie's poem, Coyote Hour, tracks the rhythms of summer in a part of coastal Maine where you can smell DEET and rotting seaweed, hear piping plovers call and speedboats growl, and spot a seal and even a former president. Melanie Almeida is the John P. Fishwick Professor of Literature at Roanoke College and a community arts organizer. Her first book of poems, On Dream Street, won the Tupelo Press Editor's Prize, and her poetry has been published in a range of journals, including the Seneca Review, Poetry, and the American Literary Review. Congratulations, Melanie.
My name is Melanie Almeida, and I'm going to read you a poem titled Coyote Hour. Late June, the fattened raccoon, precise as a garbage man, tips the garbage cans and outspill the remnants of last week's renters' lobster feasts. The carcasses cooked to a cerulean red are scattered hieroglyphics. No matter the weather, at 4 a.m., the millionaire sprinklers hiss on, mist the skinny birch. His yard is as lush as a new carpet. In 2 weeks flat last summer, his house cropped up kit quick. The summer visitors arrive gleefully. Armed with DEET and rosé, they sit in clutches on the beach while the piping plovers peet back to fenced enclosures. By July, seaweed clots rot corporeally, draw flies. The horizon buzzes with motors. I can't tell from here which boats might be stalled among the buoys or which might be fishing for hours. A former president summers near. His security men patrol the bay and speedboat called Fidelity. The marsh does its crabbed best, will its nest, and least turns careen themselves over the high tide, certain from minnows. September arrives as a sigh of quiet. I walk the rack line. A seal telescopes up, stares back at me like an old self. Cool lapses in. One dusk, a skinny coyote steps from the marsh into the light cast by the fire pit I contrived of discarded bricks. She does not startle, raises her gaze to me, then trots off toward the field that borders a field that borders a highway. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Tim Disney. It's my pleasure and honor to sponsor this prize. Thank you, Melanie. That was beautiful. For 14 years, Zócalo Public Square has awarded its annual book prize to the author of a nonfiction book that best enhances our understanding of community and the forces that strengthen or undermine human connectedness and social cohesion. I'm honored to present this year's prize to Héctor Tobar for his magnificent book, Our Migrant Souls, a meditation on race and the meaning and myths of Latino. Héctor Tobar is a Los Angeles-born author of 6 books. His nonfiction book, Deep Down Dark, was a New York Times bestseller. His novel, The Barbarian Nurseries, won the California Book Award Gold Medal, and his fiction has appeared in Best American Short Stories. He earned his MFA from UC Irvine, where he is currently a faculty member. At the Los Angeles Times, he was a foreign correspondent and won a Pulitzer Prize. Tobar has been a Guggenheim Fellow, an op-ed writer for the New York Times, and a contributor to The New Yorker. He is the son of Guatemalan immigrants. I found this book to be very affecting. It is at once sweeping in scope, but also deeply intimate and personal. It's not about my experience, but I felt very connected to it for a variety of reasons. Partly, perhaps, because as a young person, I had a job on Herald Way, where you lived as a young man, and also years later coached youth soccer on Madison Street, where you also lived later. Maybe I also felt myself to be the counterparty to some of the relationships that you described in this book. Maybe antagonist, maybe too strong a word, but something in that zone. At its core, at least for me, this book drove deeply into the dissonance or the paradox between our very human compulsion to categorize, to separate, and to otherize, and on the other hand, our equally human capacity for decency, love, and connection. I learned a lot from reading this book. Thank you for writing it, Héctor, and congratulations. If I was on it, I would just whip it out for you. I don't have that in me.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful honor. To receive the Zócalo Prize is deeply meaningful for me as an author and as a native son of the city of Los Angeles. Today, we're gathered in a figurative Zócalo, a crossroads, a meeting place. And today I want to talk to you about the people of Los Angeles and how their journeys have brought them to many different kinds of gathering places or Zócalos. Zócalo is a Spanish word, and the fact that there's an organization in LA founded by Arizona State University that chooses to call itself Zócalo with an accent over the O is a sign of how Latino the city of Los Angeles has become and how comfortable we are with a bit of Spanish thrown into our English. Zócalo is a word with a history that's a bit like the city of Los Angeles and like the history of the term Latino. If you Google Zócalo, that search engine will tell you incorrectly that it's an Aztec word. That's a mistake a lot of people make, because the most famous Zócalo in the world is the central square in Mexico City, which was once the center of the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. When the Spanish conquered Tenochtitlan in 1521, they tore down the Aztec temples in the city center and used the stones to build a Catholic cathedral. They called their new plaza a Zócalo, which was a word then in common usage in Spanish. But Zócalo itself is derived from the Italian zoccolo, meaning base, foot, or foundation, and zoccolo comes from a Latin word meaning sock. The term Latino is also derived from Latin, of course, and today, if you stand in the Zócalo in Mexico City, or just about any public place in the city of Los Angeles, you'll discover it's filled with Latino people. To be Latino is to be a product of the sometimes violent, sometimes amorous collision and mixing of cultures. But the people who first built the town today known as Los Angeles in 1781 didn't call themselves Latino. They migrated overland from what is now northern Mexico. Those settlers laid out the first town square on land taken from the Tongva, and native labor helped to build its first structures, including the church that still stands there. In the first count of LA's residents, the local authorities classified the settlers according to the race and caste labels invented by the Spanish colonial authorities: black, Indian, Spaniard, mulatto, mestizo. Each one of those words has its own history tied to the building of the Spanish Empire. Black is tied to the creation of slavery. Mulatto is a hateful, archaic term derived from the word for mule. As the people of the New World mixed more and more, the Spanish had to invent more of these caste names. The one that's the most common in the most common usage in Los Angeles today is Cholo, which was originally a name for a person with one parent who is indigenous and one who is mestizo, or if you're into math, 1/4 European and 3/4 Indian. Of course, it's ridiculous and offensive to think of human beings as fractions, but there's always been strangeness and myth-making behind race ideas. During the Inquisition, for example, the Spaniards created the idea that Jewishness was something that you can pass down through the blood. So it didn't matter if you converted to Catholicism, you could still be persecuted for being a Jew. Centuries later, the Nazis referred to the Jews as a race distinct from Aryans and invented all sorts of pseudoscience to prove that this was so. But people of Jewish heritage themselves have a complex and often fluid relationship to that identity. And so it was with the founders of the city of Los Angeles and their identities, which explains why, in the second census of the city of Los Angeles, taken 9 years after the town's founding, many of those settlers had undergone a caste shift. A man who was mestizo became Spanish. A man who was Indian became a coyote, another term for a person of mixed mestizo and indigenous ancestry. These Angelenos were, in effect, moving up the caste ladder. Arriving in Los Angeles, far from the centers of colonial and royal power, allowed them this small token of social mobility. Now, if you go to the old town square of the late 18th and early 19th century Los Angeles, now known as La Placita, or El Pueblo de Los Angeles, or Olvera Street in the tourist guides, the biggest building is the Pico House, which was built by the last Mexican governor of California, Pío Pico. Pío Pico was born in 1801, 20 years after the founding of the city of Los Angeles. Today, many historians refer to him as Afro-Mexican, but he did not call himself black or any other Spanish caste label. He called himself by a new ethnic term, Californio. Today, historians refer to the creation of the ethnicity Californio in the late 19th century as an ethnogenesis. I think Pío Pico built the Pico House in part as a monument to the greatness of the Californios. He had been born in the Spanish Empire, lived later in the Republic of Mexico, and finally in the United States, which took California in a war of manifest destiny. American rule made Pío Pico destitute, and he died 4 blocks from here on West 15th Street, just across Pico Boulevard. In his obituary in the September 12, 1894 edition of the Los Angeles Herald, the writer said he had seen Pio Pico just days earlier, riding his horse and buggy down the very streets that surround us. In the years after the death of Pio Pico, Los Angeles flooded with migrants and immigrants, many of them from the poor corners of Europe, and it became the metropolis it is today. One of those migrants was Paul Dimitri, whose parents arrived from the Balkans 20 years after the death of Pio Pico. Paul Dimitri sold newspapers for the Los Angeles Herald Express, which later became the Los Angeles Herald Examiner, the newspaper based in this building. Paul told me that the best day to sell newspapers in South LA in the 1930s was when the German boxer Max Schmeling fought a match. We'd sell the extras at around midnight, he said. Some people would pay up to $1 for an extra. It was easy money. Paul Dimitri's parents were born in the town of Negovan in what was then called Macedonia. And if you go to Negovan today, you'll find it's called Flampuro, and that a Greek flag flies over its town square. But back when Paul's family lived there, it was in the Ottoman Empire. In the Balkans, the empire included Greeks, Jews, Gypsies, Turks, Romanians, Bulgarians, and Albanians, and many others. These national and religious terms dominated the census. And the 1903 Ottoman census of Macedonia, the residents of towns like Negovan often argued with the Ottoman authorities over how the census would count them. Greeks wanted their towns counted as communities of the Greek Orthodox Church, and Bulgarians wanted to be counted as communities of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church. Negovan and much of Ottoman Macedonia was caught up in a conflict called the Macedonian Struggle, which involved acts of violence between competing Bulgarian and Greek and Serbian nationalist causes. 8,000 people were killed. The Dimitris escaped this violence when they migrated to California, and the next time they were counted was in the 1920 census of the United States, when they lived on the 600 block of East 51st Street here in Los Angeles. Paul Dimitri told me he was Greek, but his parents told the US Census that their native tongue was Albanian. And the census taker later listed their race as something they had never been called in the Ottoman Empire: white. In fact, on that census, every family on the 600 block of East 51st Street in South Los Angeles was identified as white. They had been born in the Irish Free State or in Germany's Second Reich. They left places of ethnic conflict, of imperial disputes, of nationalist fervors and prejudices, and they came to a place where they were just white. That's one of the things that white meant then. It meant you had left behind the old world, its ethnic and its class and caste restrictions, and that you entered that great space of freedom and opportunity called white. In the first half of the 20th century, Los Angeles and California put a lot of energy into creating the idea of white, with restrictive covenants and official racial segregation and anti-miscegenation laws. But Paul Dimitri did not live exclusively in a white city. He proudly told me about going to a gathering place called Central Avenue, where he could be inside the beating heart of Black Los Angeles. He remembered the Chinese settlement that existed next to the South LA rail yard where his father worked. And in 2014, when he was 90 years old, he wrote an email to a writer then known in the LA Times newsroom as its Latino columnist, me. I did not grow up calling myself Latino. That word wasn't part of my LA vernacular. I called myself Guatemalan. When I was a toddler, my parents took me to the old Zócalo of Los Angeles, its placita, and there they performed a ritual common to Angelenos of my generation. They took a picture of me sitting on top of a stuffed burro. Both of my parents are listed on my Los Angeles County birth certificate as Caucasian, a term that no Guatemalteco had ever used or even heard. Back then, we people of Mexican and Central American and South American descent were destined, once we became white enough, in both the figurative and literal senses of the word, to be the next people to be invited into the safe, privileged ground of American whiteness. But then the racial ground of California started to shift beneath our feet. When I got to the LA Times, I became Latino, because that publication had adopted the term in the 1980s as its house style for people of Latin American descent, in response to the fact that there were suddenly millions more Latino working people living in California. Many of its plazas and its parks had filled with Latino people with roots in a dozen different countries. The term Mexican American and the term Chicano, both born of an earlier 20th century ethnogenesis, didn't fit these people. And so the reporters and editors of the LA Times helped speed along a new ethnogenesis, the creation of Latino. Unfortunately, Latino hides our indigenous and our African heritage and replaces it with a term whose etymology goes back to Europe and Rome. Like every other ethnic and racial term, Latino places a simple, one-dimensional label on relationships that are filled with complexity and nuance. Sometimes we wear those terms proudly, and other times they fit us like loose clothes or like a sign someone stuck on our back. And sometimes, if we don't fit them, we make up new ones. In my time, in the same South Los Angeles streets where Paul Dimitri lived, I've seen a new ethnogenesis, the birth of Blaxican. The all-white neighborhoods of South LA became black neighborhoods, and then black and Latino neighborhoods, and people there met and created new families that are both those things, that are Blaxican. And now we are living in a nationwide ratiogenesis. In the 2030 census, you will likely be able to answer the old race question by declaring yourself not just black or white or Asian, but also Latino. This does not mean that a team of scientists studied our DNA, our facial features and skulls, and determined that there is a biological commonality to us. No. To say today that Latino people are a race means only one thing. It means that we have a relationship to the United States that is racial. Race is an idea that explains why some people have power and others don't, why some labor more and others labor less. It's also an idea of resistance, of community. To wear a race label means, like many other groups before us, that we are seen collectively as outsiders to an established order. It means that people believe that we have a common way of being, something programmed inside of us at birth, like the Americans who were enslaved and who became black and its synonyms in the early censuses of the United States, like the immigrant workers who were forbidden from marrying whites and who were classified by the race label Chinese in the 1870 census. So when we talk about those labels, we can't treat them as if they were handed down to us by God or biology or by a panel of smart Ivy Leaguers. We shouldn't waste time about arguing about who belongs in that category and who doesn't, or why people who bear that label don't all vote the same way, as if we believe that being born into a group meant you should all think the same way. Instead, we should treat those labels as artifacts of a human journey, as myths made up to explain what a people are, and as a true story a people tell about their families and their dreams. Latino is a story of empire, of exploitation, and it's a story about the work and the struggles that have made us into a community in our barrios and the gathering places and in the Zócalos we call home. Thank you very much.
Hector, that was beautiful. I was already riding off the high of revisiting your book, and then I got to hear that lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I mean, especially as someone who is from LA, loves LA, and as I was driving here, kind of saw all our different LAs and our different Latino LAs, just to see you do that in this kind of palimpsest way right now.
Oh, thank you.
By giving us those layers and including the diversity of it. So thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Natalia Molina, and as you heard a few minutes ago, I'm a historian who writes about the interconnected histories of race, place, culture, gender, and citizenship. And I'm so excited to speak to you, delve in a little deeper about your beautiful book, Our Migrant Souls. First, congratulations. I got to read it for Zócalo, when I blurbed it before I even knew, or, the prize was just a glimpse in our eye at that point. And I got to reread it for this interview. And each time it just strikes me as a tour de force about the many meanings of Latino history, identity, experiences across the US, across time, and across borders. You've written many books, many types of books also.
Right.
You've won a Pulitzer. But what made you want to write this book now? I was really struck as I was reading it that you really are bringing a lifetime of experiences.
Absolutely, yes.
I just picture you having all these stories in your head as a journalist, as someone who comes to it with many, it's all of you coming to it. It's
right.
A journalist, it's a writer, it's someone who's lived outside of the US, it's someone who's a son, it's someone who's a father. So what made you want to write this book now? And also, what have you learned since writing it, from talking to people, from touring? Hector's been on tour for like a year talking about this book. So.
Right. Well, first of all, Natalia, thank you so much for agreeing to do this, and I'm so honored that we would be up here together, and to Zócalo for the book prize and everyone involved with it. Such a great team. Like you say, I've been listening to Latino people. I've been listening to people as a job for 30 years, because a journalist interviewed people on the streets, around this building, more than once. And you just learn about the complexity of the place where you live in, because so often we're working on stories that have two sides, or have very clear black and white issues, and yet when you talk to people, their stories don't fit inside black and white. There's always shades of gray and nuance. And then I became a university professor, and my job was, as your job is to channel these beautiful young minds of people who are, every year they arrive and they're still idealistic, and they have their ambitions. People have so many cliches about young people and how they're, don't care. My experience is todo lo opuesto, everything opposite. It's just the people who are very passionate, especially when you show them respect. And so part of my pedagogy is to say, look, I am here to learn from you as much as you are to learn from me. And, because there's a whole aspect of the American experience that isn't yet in books. You and I know how difficult it is to publish a book, how difficult it is to become a writer, how many years that takes. And yet, we have young people, our students, who are in their 20s and have already learned to observe, and who have like a lifetime of processing the passion, the trauma, the pride and the ambition, and with just a little bit of encouragement of, here are some basics of creative writing, here's some metaphors, give me nicknames, throw me your vernacular. I want you to make me feel old. I want to hear what the new curse words are. I want to know. And I get it back, and it's just really wonderful. And so having heard that, and then seeing the Black Lives Matter movement, and seeing this explosion of conversation about race, but Latino people who are racialized in so many ways never really being part of that conversation, that really stoked my fire. Because I had the beautiful example of James Baldwin, 1960s, writing about a time when black people are hated. And us living through this time where there's so many hateful ideas about Latino people, and also just so much discrimination and exploitation. And so I just felt that desire to just get it on the page and to be absolutely as clear and direct as possible.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting that you brought up that moment of the pandemic. For me, someone who's written on public health and race, I started getting interviewed really early on in the pandemic. You know, anti-Asian racism. Is this new? Are you surprised?
Right.
And it's like, no, of course we're not surprised. But I think a lot of people were seeing this genealogy of that racism, anti-Asian racism, as going back to the 1882 Exclusion Act.
Right.
Or here in LA, the lynching of Chinese. When what I tried to bring to the conversation is also, no, we otherize groups all the time, and we demonize them by talking about them as disease carriers or what have you. You have that in your book in terms of, you know, the book is this meditation on the meanings of Latino, but a central figure in in a few of your chapters is Wong Kim Ark.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's a really wonderful way to bring in and to really kind of think about what it means to not belong and how we shape our belonging, and how this is a theme that cuts across many of experiences. Can you talk about the figure that Wong Kim Ark plays for you in the book?
You know, I knew about birthright citizenship, and how we became citizen. You know, I knew that there was a distant, civil rights case. And I was driving cross country and I listened to this beautiful podcast called The Memory Palace. And there was an episode like 10 minutes long about Wong Kim Ark, and it was just really poetic and beautiful. And so I read more about him. And essentially Wong Kim Ark was born in San Francisco, the son of Chinese immigrants. But he lived in a period when there was very little legal migration allowed. So he had been born from an earlier generation of immigrants, and there was an anti-Chinese movement. And so he traveled back to China in part because he wanted to start a family. He wanted, like the way many of our families travel back and forth, if they can, right? If they can. And so he returns from one of his trips to China back to his home in San Francisco. They don't want to let him on they don't want to let him through customs. They put him in immigration detention, the immigration detention of his day, on a ship in San Francisco Bay for months. And eventually his case wound up to the Supreme Court, which determined that if you were born in the United States, you are, if a natural birth in Los Angeles, in the United States, you are an American citizen. And so his case is just one more, it's just one more example of the way in which our stories are interwoven with American history. And so my citizenship that I get when I'm born here in 1963 from 2 immigrant parents and a tourist visa, which makes me, according to Fox News, an anchor baby, right? That citizenship goes back not just to Wong Kim Ark, but to the Chinese community, which organized and paid for the lawyers, because it was this whole community effort. And then, our stories are braided in so many ways, because then I went back to Guatemala, to my father's village, and I discovered that eastern Guatemala, where my father's from, has this whole Chinese thing going on. I mean, the story I heard of the guerrilla leader who came into town, the Marxist guerrilla leader who was a Chinese Guatemalan, Marco Antonio Yon Sosa, came into the town, and I went to the cemetery where my grandfather is buried. There's pagodas in the cemetery. There's a whole Chinese community that goes back there. And so, to me, everywhere you look in American and Latin American history, you see these braiding of these different experiences. Yeah.
I totally hear you in your book and right now in your talk when you mention, Latino isn't a word that, we grew up with, it's invented,
right.
It can be very flattening. I myself grew up calling myself Mexican. I was the first one in my family to go to college. My brother used to love to tease me, telling everybody, we always thought we were Mexican, but then she went to UCLA and now she's Chicana. Right? It's this way these right. identities evolve. Right. So yes, there are times that I kind of don that as a label, and yet growing up in LA with majority Mexicans, and then seeing how it changed as Central Americans came into LA and wanting to connect, Latino became Absolutely. An important word to me. And then especially as you said, teaching and how much our students teach us, learning about Latinx and how that was inclusive, even if there are ways that, in Spanish language you can't
right.
say that, all these kinds of things. When do you feel most Latino, and when do you feel least Latino? And is that ever place-based?
Well, when I sit in my living room, I feel pretty Latino because I'm married into a Mexican family, Mexican-American, Mexican family. My father-in-law is Mexican American, 2 or 3 generations. My mother-in-law was born in Juarez. And so my kids are Mexican, Guatemalan, Angelenos. It's much easier just to think of them as Latino. So Latino is this alliance. And it's what it is, it's people who have experiences that are very similar, agreeing to, let's see if we can stand in the community of our commonalities. It's just a really beautiful kind of, me and, of course, Salvadorans. I grew up with a lot of Salvadorans too, and especially when I came back from college in the 90s, LA was filled with Salvadorans. It's kind of very similar to Guatemalans, but a lot different. Salvadorans are a lot more assertive, than we Guatemaltecos. That's the stereotype, but it's also kind of true. And so, because it's a much more urban place. Guatemala is they're both indigenous places, but Guatemala is a lot more indigenous, I think, than El Salvador is. Guatemala still has an indigenous kind of continuity in its history that's been a little bit more broken in El Salvador and even more broken in places like Argentina, right? But and so it's this commonality where we say, look, we have a common relationship. It's not just because people see us the same, because people in a little town in Missouri can't tell the difference between a Mexican or an Ecuadorian. No. It's not just that, it's because we also have these common experiences. And it's what we build, it's how we build community. Absolutely.
You and I are both from this beautiful city.
Los Angeles, yay.
And yet, I always say Latinx identity can differ by zip code in LA.
Oh my God, absolutely.
Right? You're growing up in East Hollywood, myself in Echo Park. I'm also someone who's really interested in place and has written place-based books. Really also to try to show people that how we understand race can differ from the West Coast to the East Coast.
Right.
And I love that the opening chapters of your book really look at place and scale. And so, you start with empire and walls and borders. It's this beautiful kind of winding down to helping us understand how race can differ from the 40,000 foot view to the 10,000 foot view, or even to the block view.
Right.
How did you get to think about race in these ways, race and ethnicity, and what does that do to our understanding of race when we can think about it at these multiple scales?
Well, I think it comes from writing novels. I used to work at a newspaper, a place like this, and we're standing right now in the room where the presses were. And there was a place like this in Los Angeles Times too, and that's a really powerful thing, And so I love newspapers. But when I went to write novels, oh my God, because in a newspaper, you interview somebody, you spend 20, 30 minutes, and then they're at one paragraph or one line. But in a novel, you can't reduce people to one dimension. You have to see the full person. And so I think that writing novels told me that the most effective writing is born of specificity, And so the part of the art of writing, anything in fiction or nonfiction, is the hunt for specificity. So in fiction, you can make it up, right? Of course, if you make up too much, you end up relying on cliche and stereotype. But in nonfiction, you have to research, as you research the hell out of everything, right? And so, so when you get down to the micro level of any place, what you see is intimacies and complexities. No one ever fits into one thing. And that's sort of what makes it all interesting anyway, right? And so, I began, for me writing this book, I used to be a sociologist when I was an undergrad. I used to be, I studied political economy. And I went through this whole thing when I was a journalist and then becoming a novelist, where I sort of let go abstraction. I let go all of that, and I approached just, what does the universe have to show me? What is this one person? What's their intimate story? And so then to be able to complete the circle and then bring back the very specific place, the neighborhood, the home, and bring that back to these big ideas. So to me, it's like completing a circle. And it's just been and I learned so much from writing for the New York Times, writing op-eds, that whole critical voice. But yeah, I just love being in that specific space. The more intimate, the better.
Oh.
Yes.
Your students are at the center of this book. It really is in so many ways a love letter to your students, reminiscent of James Baldwin, as you tell us. And you draw on their essays throughout the books to show that specificity.
Right.
Passages just bring tears to one's eyes. What changes have you seen across the years in your students? I think about it in terms of, for me, like one of the things that comes to my mind is how they talk about being undocumented in ways that I felt was much more silenced before. And they're, I don't know if it's DACA, I don't know if it's a generation of their parents, but there's a way in which they bring it into their essays or their class experiences in ways that I haven't seen. So I'm wondering what stands out to you, or if it's that, in what ways?
Well, people have a way of processing traumas and processing things that embarrass them and turning them into something powerful. Like the term Chicano is that. Chicano used to be an insult, Cholo is a race term that has a whole set of different meanings. And so now, for example, my discovery, I think, most of us Latino people, we're a little embarrassed of our Spanish. It's like, I'm got pretty fluent because I lived in Mexico, education abroad, but, we're a little self-conscious about it. And so what does the new generation do? They make up a term for it. I'm a no sabo kid. You can buy t-shirts and mugs that say no sabo kid, And so it's like it's taking that thing that makes, because it's supposed to be part of, what does it mean to be Latino? Well, is it like, I can dance? Well, maybe not, what does it mean, right? And so it's supposed to be this language thing. And so people, find a way to sort of, but so many things are like that. DACA, right, which is a bureaucratic term, which people turn into documented, and so the whole thing too about being undocumented, absolutely, people, you and I both know so many graduate students and PhDs who are undocumented and who carry that term as almost like, it's the chip on their shoulder. I still have a chip on my shoulder, but it's not because I'm undocumented. But it's that chip that sort of like makes you assertive, especially assertive. I have to jump higher. I have to be more, But the other thing I think I've noticed is just, I think that, people are living in an age of less opportunity than we grew up in. And so, and of more difficult choices. And that's the other part, is seeing that. But also, and finally, the other thing is just incredible ease with multiculturalism, multi-race. I can't tell you half the stories I read are about interracial relationships. I met my Chinese girlfriend's family, and this happened. Or I'm dating this Armenian guy, and this happened. Or and it's like all this. It's just this incredible ease in which people cross paths. Like, I have so many Filipino students, and that's almost like, it's so familiar, and there's like this really, really close bonding. I grew up with this too, in Filipino and Latino, Mexican, Central American, Los Angeles. So all of that is, I see people are more assertive about it.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Versus, it was a big deal in our family, you have blacks again. We were very happy when we now have our Filipino nieces and nephews.
Right, exactly.
But it's definitely something more common, and just more that people, like you said, that they talk about, and that they want to learn more about, and that they expect those stories to be out there in a way that they hadn't before, I think.
Yes, exactly, exactly. They're less tolerant of the erasures, I hope. Yes. Let us
all be less tolerant of the erasures.
Yes.
Let me ask you one more question before we turn to our Q&A. There's such a celebration of Latinidad, of Latinos in your book, and there's also a lot of pain.
Yes.
As there is in life, right? There's joy, there's sorrow. There are stereotypes of Latinos, flattened representations, Hollywood, media, everyday life. There's this long history of anti-immigrant sentiment in California, as we know, Prop 187, the early 2000s with the anti-immigration bills, changes in politics, and as you write about in the book, white supremacy, sometimes even purported by Latinos. Yet you end your book with a discussion of hope, of utopia, of what we can learn by queer Latinidad. And so what do we need to do to keep that hope alive, to keep the story of Latinos as one of hope?
Wow, that's a great question. I mean, to me personally, it's just never allowing my curiosity to be totally satisfied. And so, I have a daughter who's queer, and she's taught me so much about queer culture and about my own country and about world culture. And just, it's like, and it's not, the thing about, the queer vision, it's not just about being queer, it's like about the way our culture, patriarchy operates, And it was like, and so that to me has been, and so embracing that spirit of curiosity and also just, embracing the idea that someone is going to surprise you, maybe in as many positive ways as they will in negative ways. And yes, utopias, I think that to me is the big thing that we need in this country, is that we need to imagine a new future. A future, as I say in my book, a future that looks beyond consumerism and individualism to new ways of community building. We need a theory of liberation. And yeah, sometimes the people who put forward theories of liberation are a little bit nuts, and they do weird things, but the existence of that radical imagination, I really find a shortage of that even now. We've been through this time, lots of, there's lots of accusation, there's lots of name calling, but let's go beyond that and let's imagine the future we want to create and what that might look like. And to me, that's the lesson from this whole exploratory journey of exploration.
Absolutely, thank you. We'll now open it up to Q&A, both in the audience and online.
Thank you. Our first question comes from online. I'm hoping to hear more about Hector's students. Are they reading the book, and what feedback have they offered about it? Have their takes been surprising in any ways?
Yeah, my students, I had one student who read the book in someone else's class. and she told that professor, wow, it's just really cool to know that he was actually reading our papers. It's like, yeah, I was reading them. And then, oh my God, it's like, I have this one student, he's Dominican Mexicano. And he's very, very Dominicano, and he's also Mexicano. He's from New York, but that's why I say really Dominicano, He's from New York, but he moved to California like a few years ago. And to me, he's this incredible writer. And I showed him the passage that's based on, his writing, and he was really, really proud. It was really wonderful to see. So it's been really positive feedback. I think that, there's a respect that I think I'm trying to show to my students, to those artists, those writers, those thinkers. Look, I respect what you had to say, and I tried to be as accurate as possible, not take anything out of context, not be manipulative. I think that's kind of a sacred thing, and I apologize if I ever did anything that was even remotely manipulative, but just seeing people respond in that way, and just young readers in general, it's been really, really wonderful at this stage in my career to be able to reach those readers. And the best thing I heard was I spoke at a class at UCLA, and the professor told me afterwards, Hector, I'm reading your book also in the seminar with graduate students, and they're starting to write like you. Oh my God, that's like the highest compliment you could ever give a writer. So that was wonderful. Thank you.
Anybody in the audience, if you have questions, please come around and line up right behind me.
Raise your hand.
But in the meantime, I've got another virtual question, which is, you explore wonderfully and deeply how the term Latino encompasses multitudes and contradictions. What are some of the specific experiences or acts of imagination that hold the identity together?
I'm sorry, I missed the last part there.
Sorry, what are some of the specific experiences or acts of imagination that hold the identity together?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I think that the story of the journey is such a central story. And just to show you, it's like, yeah, I mean, okay, migration has slowed down, and it's conceivable that they could close it down completely. But let us remember, that Jewish identity is based on a journey that took place 5,000 years ago, where they celebrated every year in Passover. And so this idea of a journey, of having this sort of distant homeland, is just one I see again and again. And then just like everyone is this beautiful epic, like the guy telling me about my father told me that when he left his pueblo, he left with a guitar. It's like, how much more romantic can you get than that? And of course, the stories become blown up so that the hills of San Isidro, Tijuana, become like, the Himalayas, and the river the little creek that runs through the pueblo becomes this raging river. And I know that this happens because it happened to me. My mother told me when I was a little kid, oh, we were poor, and I was supposed to be ashamed where we lived, because we lived in this hole. And I thought she meant an actual hole, that there were ladders that she had to climb down to get down to where she lived, in this hole. And so there's, it's just these wonderful epic tales that people have, and that full of drama and comedy and all these unexpected things. Yes.
Hi, Hector. My name is Melvin. And I got to browse through your book early before the presentation. And there's something that towards the end of the book you wrote something that caught my attention, among other things. And this is what grabbed my attention just because of the way that I've been feeling about being Latino in the United States, having children growing up here, being an immigrant myself, and wondering whether I need to start thinking about going back to where I was born in El Salvador. But you wrote, to live in the United States of the first decades of the 21st century is to see everywhere the evidence of the cruel unwinding of the American project, its unsustainability, period. Can you speak to that? What is it that you were writing, thinking about at the time that you wrote that? Or,
I think about that every day. I think about that every day because I live in Los Angeles. And as you know, those of you who are Angelenos, and especially native Angelenos, just to see the growing population of unhoused people in our city and the growing disparities with wealth and poverty, to me that is, that's what I mean by the cruel unwinding of the American project. There's a book called The Unwinding by this great New Yorker writer, George Packer, about the changes in the American economy in the last 20, 30, 40 years. Because the truth is, the country that we were born into, the California that we lived in had a growth, the gross domestic product was increasing like at rates of 5, 10, 15% or whatever, really, really, the economy was booming. And so we don't have, the surplus to fund that lifestyle. And not only that, it's all based on a subtraction from somewhere else. I mean, you think about I have so many upper middle class friends who's, and myself included, we've had, help from other people who work in other countries. And so our comfort and affluence are based on this inequality. And so I think that it's everywhere. And I think maybe part of what our community is fated to do is to be among the people who speak about this and how we need to move forward. So that's what I mean by the cruel unwinding of the American project. Yes, thank you.
Hi, my name is Fabiola, and my question is, Natalia brought up Proposition 187, and since it's an election year, we always get this thing about the Latino or Hispanic community like a big sleeping giant. In your travels and writing the book, do you think it's a generalization of clumping a group of different experiences together simply because of the region, or is it something that rings true?
I think that they're both things, you know. I think, first of all, I personally, you know, that metaphor of sleeping giant is right there along with in the shadows as kind of like phrases that I think don't really say anything and that just really kind of, you know, I just feel the need to sort of, but it is kind of true because I think that there are, you know, there is this untapped mobilization of American society that I keep expecting to happen. It did happen in 2005 and 2006. We had 1 million people on the streets. And to me, that what happened in 2005, it was 2005, right? Or 2006? 2006. You know, 1 million people on the streets of Los Angeles. And like, this happened, it was like Black Lives Matter, where you hear of a Black Lives Matter, you know, thing in Visalia or some, you know, or some little place in Kansas. That happened all across the United States. And to me, that is the big engine of change. Because otherwise, you know, this whole thing with 11 million undocumented people, it could last 100 years. We could be like, just like the time between the end of the Civil War and the passage of the Civil Rights Act, 1865 to 1965, 100 years. And so that is my great fear, is that this creation of a caste of people who are denied rights, or even if they're not just, who are seen as this laboring caste, which is what a lot of people see us as, that could last a long time, unless, you know, the sleeping giant awakens. But to me, that mobilization isn't just about Latino identity, it's about class, and it's about working people, and about the defense of the rights of working people. And so to me, that's the big thing that I hope will come. That when Latino, you know, in Los Angeles, for example, most of the leadership of the labor movement is Latino. So, yes, thank you.
Hi there, my name is Michael Perez. I'm half Dominican and half Mexican, born in NorCal, but I went to USC, so fight on. My question really comes about your experience, and Natalia mentioned your students evolving and, you know, growing with this new day and age, and we're all assimilating, as I was learned and I learned from my parents. I don't have an E accent over my E, just like Zócalo does. But my question really is, do you see a trend in a evolution of people not wanting to identify themselves with these names that the society and the caste systems have imposed on us? If I didn't want to say I'm Hispanic or Latino, is there some sort of convergence or a general trend in, you know, we're all one?
Right, I think it really, I think that those race ideas correspond to a reality of discrimination and inequality. But at the same time, the labels themselves, there are so many of us who just don't quite fit in them. And people are embarrassed that they don't. You know, it's like, you know, like, so I have a professor friend, for example, and she's Cuban Canadian. And so she has this whole long, what are you? And so she has this whole long explanation of how her family ended up in Canada, you know? And a lot of people in LA, you know, it's like, well, I kind of, you know, my grandfather's Filipino, but he married this, you know, native woman from New Mexico. And it's this whole long story. And so I think that people, I'm hoping that people, you know, can find ways of stepping outside of the limitations of those. But at the same time, just learning about all these different stories is extremely important. I mean, Dominican history is incredible. You know, I mean, I have my students read Junot Díaz's Oscar Wilde, and just the attitude and the power of his voice, and just the race in Dominican history, you know, and the incredible diversity of the Dominican Republic as a place, like the rest of the Caribbean. So I think that it's just, I really do feel, yes, that I feel that people, you know, are finding their way to live outside of the labels, but at the same time, it is extremely important to realize the way these specific histories really matter, and how much filled they are with lessons for us to learn.
Now we have time for just one more question, but a reminder to our in-person audience, you'll have time to chat with our speakers at our reception, so hang tight.
Hi, I'm Gabriel Sanchez from Los Angeles, and my question kind of builds on that. I certainly understand the utility of having a term like Latino or Latinx or even Hispanic, but from listening from everything you've said, there's going to be another term later, right? Because we started in one place with all the, from the earlier, when you were first speaking. So what's going to be next? And in particular, what struck me was how the term Latino and how you described it, it denies the roots, indigenous roots and African roots that many of us share. So how can then we influence the development of that next term?
Well, I think, you know, for example, my own personal project now is to understand the roots of Los Angeles and its indigeneity. So we're in a place, you know, of these different groups of people. Tongva, all the different groups, Chumash, all the names that they have, which weren't their names or whatever. And I think that the indigeneity of LA isn't just something that we should recognize in the land acknowledgement, you know? That I think that so much of our way of being was born in this genocidal time, because really there is now, there's now long studies of the California genocide. And so I think that the construction of this modern world involved the suppression of this indigenous identity, but also it seeped into our lives. You know, how many Mexican families are there, Mexican-American families in LA, who have that, Gabrielino or that Navajo, relative? And it's just, I believe it isn't erased completely. I believe it's in our way of being. I'm from Guatemala, and I've tried so hard to pin down the specificity of my indigenous heritage, but I wasn't. It's very difficult. All the birth records from the 1880s are written in, they're handwritten in these old. It's extremely difficult to track down, and so I know that indigeneity has shaped our way of being in Los Angeles, and that's, like, for me, one of the ways in which we can think about what Latino means, because Latino has absorbed so much of indigenous culture. It's absorbed African culture, right, in many places. And so I think it's part of our responsibility to understand that, not treat it as something exotic, but treat it as something that is as much as of our being as the pilgrims. I was going to say the Pinchy pilgrims, but and so, but I think that's fine for public television. So that's my answer. Thank you very much for the question. Thank you.
Well, on that note, we'll end our conversation here. Thank you, Hector. Thank you so much. Congratulations on receiving the 2024 Zócalo Book Prize, Our Migrant Souls. What an accomplishment.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you, everyone in our audience and joining us here and online. Please stay for the reception. Pick up a copy of Our Migrant Souls from our book partner, Teachuchas. And to close us out, it's my pleasure to introduce Moira Shuri, our Executive Director of Zócalo Public Square.
Hi, everyone. As Natalia said, I'm Moira, and I'm very proud to lead my amazing team at Zócalo Public Square, and also welcome and thank all of my colleagues at Arizona State University Media Enterprise. So Zócalo's Book and Poetry Prize doubles every year as our birthday. Last year, we cut a cake to celebrate our 20th year of connecting people to ideas and to each other. This year is our 21st birthday, so we are legal to drink. So we do have some special cocktails for you. And we have something new to share with you. We are premiering our very first Zócalo video tonight. If you like what you see, please share the video, subscribe to our newsletter and our podcast, and join us in person or online for more insightful conversations.
Curiosity moves us. It gets us across the street,
the city,
the region, across state lines, and party lines.
from what we've seen along the way, we're in some very good company. Where the spirit of curiosity is not only alive and well.
It's how we discover all we share.
In the public square.
We've spent the last 20 years connecting people to ideas
and to each other.
And we're just getting started. We're always open,
always free,
and you're always invited. Curiosity loves company.